And Doctor, we were just talking about the phone. You didn't have one of these, did you?
I absolutely did.
You did? And
Yeah,
you
I
knew
think
what
I got
this
one
is?
for my 16th birthday with my own phone number.
You didn't have a push button though, did you? This is a rotary.
I had a rotary and then got upgraded later to a push button. And then the cordless came in high school.
Oh, wow. Wow. With the antenna that you went.
Exactly.
You guys are catching us midway through conversation. The doctor and I have been chatting here for a moment. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Lemon Live at 5. We've really prepared one hell of a show for all of you this evening. It's a special Juneteenth evening, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. I'm going to talk about that with one of the most brilliant men in America, really. And his name is Dr. Robert Livingston. Dr. Livingston is a social psychologist. He is a leading expert on the science underlying bias and racism in organizations and a lecturer of public policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Dr. Livingston, calling Dr. Livingston. Did your phone ring? I don't know.
The landline is in the 90s.
Do you have a landline still?
I don't. I scrapped it decades ago.
I have a landline. Do you notice how clear it is when you talk on the landline?
I do. Yeah.
I was telling you, it's like the old Whitney Houston. You said it was like, what was the pin drop?
The MCI pin drop commercial.
Yeah. For me, it was like, I think it was AT&T, and it was Clear Voice by Whitney Houston. They had her singing, and she was like, I can hear loud and clear your true voice. So anyway, good evening. Thank you. How you doing? What are you thinking about on this Juneteenth?
Trying to beat the heat.
Yep. Is that what you're thinking about? What are you thinking about on Juneteenth?
I'm thinking about freedom. I'm thinking about the constant struggle for it and why it seems so hard to grasp and hold on to.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, our nation since Juneteenth has sort of seen this cycle of 2 steps forward, 1 step or 2 steps, or sometimes 3 steps backwards. And it seems to be this constant, iteration of tyranny, democracy, and sort of freedom and oppression, rather than sort of moving in a unidirectional path towards freedom, which is what we would all like to see, or at least most of us would like to see.
It's not quite so linear, right? It's just
No.
more like, yeah. Okay. A little bit more about the doctor. In case anyone in the audience is interested, Dr. Livingston's research ranges from micro level experimental investigations of the psychological and physiological processes that underline implicit bias like stereotyping and prejudice to more macro level examinations of discrimination in society and the workplace, particularly in upper level leadership positions. Suffice it to say, he is a very, very smart man. And this is what we're going to talk about. Obviously, we're here to talk about Juneteenth. We're going to talk about Dr. Livingston's research, the politicization of DEI. We've heard so much about that. I don't know, is it politicization? Yes. But also, Dr. nod your head if you agree with me, is a weaponization of DEI. Correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And then we're going to talk about Trump, Biden, and black voters, and then whatever else is on the doctor's mind. So thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Livingston, you said freedom is on your mind, but what does Juneteenth mean to you?
So Juneteenth means a lot to me. I think it's, it's a shame that it's come so late, this recognition of American freedom, I think, because in many ways, our Independence Day doesn't represent independence or freedom for everyone. And I think having this holiday signals a certain level of awareness and inclusion of all Americans and not just some Americans.
Yeah. And what did you do? I'm wondering how people celebrated today, because I don't think you really have to do anything. I think what I did was try to do a little bit more research on what Juneteenth means, on the ancestors, and then just also try to have a nice lunch and enjoy myself on this day off and just sort of memorialize. Is that okay?
It's your day. It's about freedom, so you're free to do whatever you wish. It's 97 degrees where I am, and I think it's 105 with the heat index. So I took advantage of the air conditioning most of the day.
So when you heard me asking the folks in the studio to move the fan closer, and if you hear that hum, it's a fan, you did not take offense to that and think I was ordering people around.
I did not. I took a cue and I got up and turned my air conditioner down a few degrees.
It is really hot here. It's hot. We're in New York City and it's very hot. So, Doctor, I'm curious on your personal relationship, honestly, with blackness. It has changed over time. And I understand that you have lived in 6 different countries. I know that you're a proud Lexingtonian. And I imagine your conception really of blackness has evolved over time as you have grown and traveled to places where understandings of race vary really greatly. No?
Well, I have, I think, a consistent relationship with blackness. I grew up in an exclusively black neighborhood. It was a middle class neighborhood in Lexington. It was one that was built in the 1960s to have, a nice place for black people to live because, many of the white people didn't want us there. So there was a benevolent man who donated hundreds of acres of farmland. There's whole history around this neighborhood. And it was called St. Martin's Village, named after the black patron saint of Peru. So I grew up with, my dentist was black, my first grade teacher was black, my third grade teacher was black, our accountant was black, our lawyer was black. I was sort of in a place where I saw blackness represented in many different professional spheres, and I never thought there was nothing that I could do. And I think when I stepped out into the world, the larger world at 18, um, I had a thick enough coat of armor to deal with the racism that I encountered. And I think also being secure in one's blackness allows one to wander more, just as secure children leave their parents more often than children that are not secure. So, I lived in France, I did a study abroad in Spain, in Mexico, in South America, I've been to Africa, I've been to pretty much every continent, but still very much identify as a black man.
And did it feel, where did you feel more at home? Did you feel more at home in America or did you feel more at home abroad?
Interesting. So it's a good question actually, Don, because there's this sort of inner conflict and one that I'm facing this year, this being an election year, because I'm not sure what I will do depending on what the outcome is. But this is clearly my home, and it's been my home for generations, and I can trace my family to Kentucky to the late 1700s according to ancestry. So I feel at home when I'm there. I feel at home when I go to church. I feel at home when I eat the food. I feel at home with the music, the trees. Everything about it is home to me, except the politics. So that's where I think it gets more comfortable to live abroad, even though this is my home. In many ways, you're able to avoid the ugly history and present that is America and its complex relationship with race.
So you said you feel at home. Did you feel at home or did it just feel familiar? Or is that one and the same?
No, it's not one and the same, and I would say it's both. But it actually feels like home to me. So for example, if the day that I pass away, that's where I want to be buried because I feel like
Oh my
that
God.
is my home.
Wow.
Um, yeah,
Because look, I haven't lived in Louisiana since 1990 something, maybe 1990, 1991. And, so I've established a presence and a home here on the East Coast in New York. But I feel like I want to be buried in Louisiana.
mhm.
It seems, is that weird?
No, I feel the same way
And
about
I don't get to visit
my
a
home.
lot, but,
Right,
yeah.
that's your home.
So
That's where
you,
your people are from.
yeah. And that little cemetery that's on the corner of, I think it's 10th Street or 12th Street and Avenue A, where everybody's buried. I'm like, are they even going to have enough room for me in that little cemetery? Which is weird, but they'll find something. Wow, that's kind of morbid, but anyways, there you go. You said something I found very interesting. You said depending on what you're going to do after the election, is there a possibility that you would leave America? Is that what you're saying?
Um, I think there's a possibility that America as we know it would cease to exist. There's it's a remote possibility, I hope, but we don't know. There's a lot of loose cannons out there right now, and so I think everybody has to be prepared for the worst while expecting the best, hoping for the best.
I'm asking the audience, this is our show where we speak to the folks in our audience. I'm asking them where they feel home the most. Um, Merle Ortega says, I'm sure there'll be room for you at that little in that little dairy where you're from in Louisiana. Um, let's see. Anna Comas says, I said happy Juneteenth to African Americans this morning while I was on my walk and got the dirtiest looks. It was totally weird. I don't know where you live, but it was fine for me. Sorry that you got dirty looks. I'm not sure what happened. Um, Jimmy Zimzam says, me too, Don. I want to go home when I am gone. And then there's Neo Jason 83, doctor, who says a majority of my family is from South Carolina. That's the case for a lot of people of color, that their roots are in the South, and somehow they end up back there. Not at all unusual, right? Yeah.
Right. And I think, Charles Blow has a very interesting idea. And there's a wonderful film called South to Black Power,
About
where he
reverse
actually,
migration, he talks about.
exactly, and saying, let's all go back home and take over the political systems, which I think is a very interesting and exciting idea.
Oh man, that's very interesting to do in Louisiana, which is a red state, but it has had a Democratic governor for a while. But it's weird because when my family comes here from Louisiana, doctor, they say they feel like they're in a totally different world. They feel like they're free. They can let their hair down. They don't have to talk about politics, or if they do talk about politics, they don't have to look over their shoulder or worry that someone's going to attack them. And it's a whole different. And I said, now you know how I feel and why I left Louisiana, and the freedom that I feel when I moved to New York. Even though New York is not perfect, but it is a different sort of thing, right? The racism hits different here than it does down there. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I'm excited to dive into your work. We talked about it before, and I was watching some of your presentations on YouTube to get more of an idea of who you are. I know who you are, but I just want to talk about your research and provide our audience with some information. Just a few minutes ago, I broadly summarized what your research does and what you provide to the audience with a better picture. Please, you provide to the audience, I should say, with a better picture of what you actually do for a living.
Yeah. So that has evolved over the last 28 to 30 years that I've been in academia. And I think I spent the first part of it publishing obscure scientific journal articles in these outlets that 20 people read. And I'm now more of a practitioner who writes popular press books and who does a lot of work with Fortune 500 companies, police departments, judiciaries, federal agencies, nonprofit organizations all over the world to try to move the needle towards greater racial equity. So what I basically do, and I say to people, I'm more of a florist than a gardener. I used to sort of have my hands in the dirt creating the blooms, but now I sort of package and distribute them. So I'm more of a distributor of information and an integrator of information. And I do a lot of bridge building between academia and quote unquote the real world, particularly business leaders, to help them use this knowledge to create more inclusive and equitable organizations.
Okay. Which would you call that DEI?
Yes, despite the fact that it's become a dirty word, but guess what? And that's just sort of the nature of this thing, right? So people started off talking about racism, and then it was racial equity, and that got too hot. And then it was social justice, and then it was diversity, right? And that was supposed to be a euphemism, right? This DEI, because people would say, well, what is diversity? We're all diverse, right? But it was such a euphemism for doing this work that people felt safe using it. And now even that is gone. So that
Yeah.
tells you something.
Yeah. Evelyn Hook says, what does that mean exactly when you were explaining? I said, is that DEI? But what does that DEI mean to you? Because it has become a pejorative, right? That people try to use it the same way as they use woke, which was not supposed to mean
exactly.
what it has been co-opted to mean. So what does that mean exactly? What is, what she says, what she's asking in the comments? What exactly does that mean, doctor?
For me, it boils down to equal opportunity, right? And that's a term that's been used for a long, long time, and actually has a specific, legal meaning. But to me, diversity, equity, and inclusion is the opposite of discrimination. That traditionally certain people have not been allowed to access organizations. They haven't been allowed to ascend within those organizations. And what DEI is saying is that there should be room for everybody who is capable of doing the job. And I don't think there's anything controversial about that. But of course, there are people in the world who don't want equal opportunity to be a real thing. What they want is social hierarchy and dominance. So of course, it's antithetical to their own self-interest.
So if you want hierarchy and social dominance, then DEI feels to you like oppression or discrimination, or is that something that you're making up in your mind? Because I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and they, about DEI, and I said, look, when the playing field is being leveled, it can feel to some people, if you're used to having the preeminent voice, as discrimination when it's actually not.
Exactly. In my book, I talk about this metaphor of Betty's butter cookies. And there's a mom named Betty who bakes a batch of butter cookies, and she gives 4 to her favorite daughter and none to her daughter who's not her favorite. And parents get really upset about it. And they scold Betty, and she feels guilty. And the next day she changes the cookie policy. Instead of giving Francis 4 and Zelda 0, she gives Francis 3 and Zelda 1. Now, that's interesting because Zelda is still upset because she's not getting a fair allocation of cookies, which would be 2 apiece. But what's interesting about that scenario is that Frances is also pissed because she feels like something has been taken away from her. And I use that to describe the relationship that white males have had with power, because traditionally they've gotten all 4 cookies. Until the 80s, the late 70s, they were 100% of Fortune 500 CEOs. They were 100% of US presidents. They were 100% of vice presidents, 100% fill in the blank, any position that has power, status, wealth attached to it. And now they're only, and you can see my air quotes, 70 to 90% of those positions. And we're talking about a segment of the population that represents 30%, because white people are 60% of the population. So white men are slightly less than 30% of the population. Yet today they occupy between 70 and 90% of those positions, when traditionally they've occupied 100. And they're furious because they feel like something's been taken away. So it's exactly what you're saying about trying to level that, and people feeling like they're entitled to what was the norm and what has been the norm for centuries.
But hold on, doctor. Hold on.
Okay.
Hold on. The kids are not getting in school because they're being, black people and minorities are being prioritized over the white kids, and the scores don't hold up, and the planes are falling out of the sky because they're lowering standards, and our medical standards are being lowered to let the dark people in, and it's not fair. We're going to die.
Unfortunately, the standards have always been lowered. And, that's, most true of, for example, I'm at an Ivy League school of legacies, right? So no one is outraged. And to explain to people in the audience who are not sure what that is, there's special consideration for the children of alumni. And, George W. Bush jokes about how he got into Yale with gentleman C's because daddy went to Yale. And I think, other people went to Yale, and no one's outraged by that. Right. And so that's like the epitome of mediocrity. But because it's a privileged segment of the population, people are sort of okay with that. They're okay with unqualified white people getting into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, but not okay with qualified people of color getting into those schools. So again, that tells you something.
So do you don't think that unqualified people of color are getting into schools?
Well, I think no system is 100%. You're trying to predict, and I've been on these admissions committees, and you're making a prediction based on a wide range of information. And I think with any job hire, I'm sure, at your organization, you've hired people that you wish you didn't hire. So if you're asking me if hiring is a perfect process, then my answer would be no.
What about the concept of DEI pushing unqualified people into positions that it wouldn't normally push people in, like CEOs?
So I'm going to repeat what I said before about and I won't, and I'm resisting the urge to name names, but there are a lot of unqualified white people, white men, in a lot of really important positions. And again, no one seems to be outraged about it, except me and my other social justice warriors, right? But America doesn't seem to have a problem with white mediocrity.
So then why do people say, well, when you hire people who are minorities, who are unqualified Even black people will say that. It hurts all of us. But no one says that when you hire an unqualified white CEO. It doesn't somehow hurt the white race or white people. It's not a reflection of the entire ethnic race. You know what I'm saying?
I do. And that is further evidence of racism, is that as a person of color, you can never exist as an individual. You're always seen as an interchangeable member of some abstract category, and you're never seen as a person. So that's part of the issue.
I want to talk a little bit more about the politicization, or as I call it, the weaponization of DEI. But let me just get into some of these categories, because I think then it might help. So, I was watching one of your presentations, and you explained the psychology of there. You said psychologically there are, in a way, three types of people. You use the metaphors of dolphin people, then you talk about shark people and ostrich people. So can you explain to our audience, and particularly how this metaphor extends to DEI and social justice?
Yeah. So, what I think is $1 million question in all of this is, when there is inequality and when there is unequal opportunity and discrimination and oppression, do you care? And there are lots of things that people in the world just don't care about. There are people who don't care about global warming. There are people who don't care about the opioid crisis. There are people who don't care about democracy. I mean, you name it. There are people who don't care about any of these things. And so those metaphors I use to sort of describe three types of people. Dolphins do care. They're concerned about equality, social justice. Sharks are the opposite. They're actually concerned about inequality. So they want there to be a food chain. They want there to be a social hierarchy, as long as they're the apex predator. Because if all the fish are sharks, they have nothing to eat. They want there to be fish that they can dominate, exploit, consume. And then ostriches don't really care. They're sort of the apathetic bunch. Wake me when it's done. I'll bury my head in the sand. You want justice, great. You want injustice, great. They're kind of the masses. They swing in whatever direction the wind blows. And most people they like to think that about 95% of the world are dolphins, or quote unquote good people. But research shows that that's not true. Only about 46% of the population are dolphins. The rest are either ostriches or sharks. And sharks are about 12% of the population. But what's really scary is that they're grossly overrepresented in top leadership positions, which makes sense, because if they're people who crave power and dominance, then they're people who will pursue that. And so they are overrepresented. And so the culture is disproportionately impacted by sharks.
Okay, so then also now explain to me something that is called the teddy bear effect.
Okay, so that's this idea that blackness and power have historically been sort of mutually exclusive in America. And one of the leading causes of lynching was just achievement among Black people. And we even saw that in Tulsa with the whole neighborhood being destroyed, with Black Wall Street. So whenever Black people prosper and Black people get ahead, that alone represents a threat to white people. So we're talking about meritocracy, but meritocracy is not evenly or equally applied to all groups, because we are supposed to, air quotes, be on the bottom, and white people are supposed to be on the top. So what the teddy bear effect is it explains this phenomenon that shows that Black leaders, so I looked specifically at Black CEOs, tend to have disarming mechanisms, and they tend to have features that make them look warmer, kinder, gentler, more docile in appearance, because that makes their power more palatable. And so one thing in particular that I found is that Black CEOs tend to be more baby-faced than other CEOs. And the more baby-faced you were, the larger the company that you ran. Now, it doesn't work the same way for white men. They're also more or less baby-faced, but it had a negative correlation with power. Because if you're a white man, you have to look the part. So if you had a more mature-faced, more angular jawline and so forth, and you looked less cuddly, then people thought you meant business. And that actually helped you as a white man. So it's interesting that the same trait that benefits black leaders, being baby-faced, actually hurt white leaders, because we're supposed to look cuddly, because that makes white people less afraid of us. Now, of course, all of this operates subconsciously, but that's the effect that we found.
And it's harder for a black man to teach people how to treat them in the workspace, because then you get called angry, or that you're somehow rude or evil or mean, because even if you have you exhibit the same traits, personality traits, as your white counterpart, it's somehow deemed negative if you're a black male displaying those same qualities.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a similar effect with women. So women who are more assertive are deemed as being aggressive, compared to men who are deemed as being,
No, they're called the B word. Let's just be honest.
Okay. You can say that. It's your show. So.
No, but that's what they call them, the B word, right? For that. Wow, this is interesting stuff. Let's see, what else do I want to ask you about? Resume whitening.
Yeah.
Speak on it. You're very familiar with this practice.
Yeah.
How do you whiten your resume?
Yeah, so this is research by Sonia Kang in Toronto, where they sent out whitened or unwhitened resumes. So if you have a name, well, first of all, let me back up and say there's research that shows that if you take identical resumes and you put the name Lakeisha Washington at the top of one of them and the name Emily Walsh at the top of one of them, and you send those resumes out to thousands of jobs, Emily will get a lot more callbacks for a job interview than Lakeisha will. Surprise, surprise. And it's not based on, because that's why I kept pushing back earlier on what you were saying about DEI being about unqualified people of color. That's a racist trope. When you can sort of control someone's qualification by creating the exact same resume, people of color are still discriminated against, and everything is the same, the grades and so forth and so on. So people of color, of course, know this. So when it comes to time to apply for a job, many choose to whiten their resume. So what Sonia Kang and colleagues found is that 33% of Black professionals and 40% of Asian professionals choose to whiten their resumes. So if your name is Lakeisha A. Washington, like A standing for Ann, when it comes time to apply for a job, you might list your name as L. Ann Washington, rather than listing Lakeisha and outing yourself as a Black woman, because you know that when employers see that they're much more likely to look over your or overlook rather your application. And so that's this phenomenon of whitening resumes. And they found that unfortunately it works, meaning that when they experimentally whitened or unwhitened people's resumes, the whitened resume got many more callbacks for a job interview. I think it was double the number of callbacks for Asians, and it was more than double the number of callbacks for Black applicants.
Really?
Yeah. So if you're Lakeisha and you called yourself Ann by your middle name, you were twice as likely to get a callback for a job interview than naming yourself Lakeisha on that resume.
Well, I speak to people all the time, and I don't know if you've seen some of the interviews that I've done with folks, including Elon Musk, who believe that there is an advantage now for Black applicants and people who are, applying to jobs. And where does that come from? Maybe it's true. Do you think that Black applicants have an advantage when they're applying for jobs and applying for college now?
No, I mean, I understand that people believe that because there is so much preaching in our culture. And when I say preaching, I really do mean lip service in our culture about the virtues of equality. And so this is a nation that's always talked about equality, even when there was no equality in practice. So I think what people are responding to is sort of the rhetoric out there about how nice it is and how good it is and how American it is to be inclusive. But the data don't really fit that narrative. And in the study that I just told you about, Don, for example, the whitening resume study, they did something really clever, these experimenters. They sent the resumes out to 800 companies that were real gung-ho about diversity. So in their mission statements in the job interview, they said, we really, really want diverse applicants. We really want people of color. We're dying to get, all this diversity. And 800 of the jobs that they sent the resumes out didn't say anything about race. They just said, we're looking to hire a qualified electrical engineer for a vacancy at our company. What they found is that the 800 companies that claimed they really wanted diversity discriminated to the same degree as the 800 companies that didn't say anything about diversity. In other words, this study proved that it is genuinely lip service, because even when you say, Lakeisha, please apply for my job, when Lakeisha applies for your job, you don't call her in for a job interview. But I think what Elon Musk is getting at is the fact that so many of these organizations are saying we really, really value diversity and we blah, blah, blah. But if you look at the rosters of so many organizations, especially in upper echelons, it just doesn't pan out.
Well, I think his thing is more on DEI in that it is lowering the standards. I had Sam Harris on, and Sam Harris said it is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is a thrust of what he was saying. It is a fact, and it's just so obvious now that if you are black and you apply to colleges or you apply for a job, that your chances of getting the job are much greater, and you know, that because companies are now looking to hire diverse people, and you're going to have a leg up and get the job. And I said to him, it just the numbers don't bear out. If you look at the actual workplaces, the number of people in color who work at the places and who are actually in positions of power, especially CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, all of these Ivy League schools that he's talking about, people having an advantage, where do they end up going? I don't see them going anywhere.
Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, Don, and you know, this is part of the whole socio-political environment that we're living in right now. There's a big difference between arguing strongly and having strong arguments. And, you know, there are lots of people who argue very strongly about all sorts of things that they have absolutely no data to back up and no knowledge of. But that doesn't stop them, right? I mean, that's the era that we're living in, this post-truth sort of era. And you know, again, if they're serious, right, if this is a serious intellectual question, you know, it's something that can be tested. That's what we do as social scientists. They can read about whether that's the truth, but I don't think it's really about the truth. I think it's about posturing. So I say, okay. Yeah. And I applaud them for their stage performance. It's great posturing, but I don't think they're really having a serious discussion about these things.
That leads me right into what I'm going to talk about. Speaking of arguing strongly but not having a strong argument, I'm sure I don't need to tell you that, you know, the laudable goals like achieving equity, diversity, it's making some people feel included, like trying to make some people feel included, has become weaponized terms in the last year or two, and even a little bit longer in the last year or two. I'm going to play a compilation, Doctor, for you and the audience that my producers put together. These are conservatives who are obsessing about the term DEI. Here it is.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what they mean by that is shut up.
DEI, in this case, stands for divisive, erroneous, and insidious.
DEI, which stands for didn't earn it.
Discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination.
But DEI forces you to discriminate.
Okay, so here's the thing. I'm going to give you some context before you saw that, you know, and there are many, many more examples of that. Amid this growing legal, social, and political backlash, so American businesses and employment professionals are quietly scrubbing DEI from public view. Last year, Eli Lilly's annual shareholders letter referenced the acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion 48 times. This year, DEI is nowhere to be found. In March, Starbucks got shareholder approval to replace representation goals with talent, performance for executive bonus incentives, and get ready for this. Meta, Tesla, DoorDash, Lyft, Home Depot, Wayfair, and Twitter were among major corporations who were making steep cuts to diversity programs in 2023, slashing the size of their DEI teams by 50% or more. So, Doctor, my question is, what do you make of, is there an anti-DEI movement? Is it real? Is it strong? And is it hurting America?
Yes, yes, and yes. It's very real. It's very strong, and I think it is hurting America. But, you know, as I mentioned before, none of this is surprising. I think such is the nature of the dialectic. In other words, you know, the day that Barack Obama was inaugurated, we knew there was going to be a reckoning. And we know that there are people in America who feel that he didn't belong there for no reason other than his skin color. Like, that's racism in its purest form. And I think we'd be fools to pretend that that doesn't exist. And so there have always been people who were anti-DEI. That's not a new thing. You know, we had anti-DEI in the 60s. We had it, you know, when there were colored only water fountains and things. That's what it is saying we don't want diversity here. We want only white people here. And that's been a perennial sentiment, I think, in our country. It just gets manifested in different ways, and this is a new manifestation of that. But I'm just appalled by the lack of sort of intellectual honesty. You know, if that's the ideology, I wish that people would at least own that.
Intellectual honesty.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you get people to own it? Because
I think you have to be smart. What my thing is, and I usually don't even engage in these kinds of conversations because I think it's akin to the emperor's new clothes, right? And we all know that fable of, you know, the emperor walking down the street in his skivvies and everyone talking about what a beautiful silk robe he's wearing. And everyone knows that he's not wearing anything. And yet they keep talking about the beautiful silk robe that he's wearing. And so I don't even get into conversations about whether the emperor is naked or not naked. We know he's naked. The real question is, why are you saying he's wearing a beautiful silk robe?
why do you say it? Is that what you said? Why do you say he's wearing a beautiful silk robe?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I'm saying is it's clear that people who are saying these things have no knowledge about DEI, no interest in diversity, and that, you know, this is really propaganda. Like, this is a game. Let's call it that. It's a game. The Emperor's New Clothes, that was a game that people were playing with themselves and with others in the society. And so, you know, you can play that game along with them, but, you know, I don't think it's a serious question. I don't think these are serious challenges. And I think the people who are putting a lot of this forward know that. And they know this is the game. And it's similar to lots of other things, Don, whether it's January 6th or whether, you know, there's so much in our country where everyone is watching the same thing and people are saying, no, that didn't happen, right? That's the essence of gaslighting. And I think it's just, you know, our choice how we deal with that, whether we want to be drawn into the gaslighting or whether we just sort of chuckle and say, okay.
It's very frustrating for people, I have to tell you, for people to experience it, to live it, and who can't quite articulate it the way that you do. But you know that when people say, I don't know what pornography is, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
That's right.
And so, but it's tough when you can't really articulate it the way that you do. So I just wonder, because you are, you know, you've been up close and personal to one of the biggest flashpoints in this war on DEI, right? And that is the ouster of Harvard President Claudine Gay. What was it like on campus while all of this was going on? I mean, do you have any reflections on that episode? She was a new president. She got called in. You know, people didn't like her answer, and then all of a sudden she's gone.
Well, you know, I think back to what I said in the beginning, you know, there were people, and it's actually some of the same vocal critics later on, who did not like her in the beginning, right? So this is back to what I said about Barack Obama and the day of his inauguration before he passed one single piece of legislation, right? There were people who had an issue with him in the White House. And I think whenever you have a person of color in power, and that's kind of what my teddy bear effect is all about, right? That there are people who have a problem with it because that's not where Black people are, quote unquote, supposed to be. And so there's all sorts of things that you can use to justify your opposition later, because no one is going to say, I don't like him because he's Black. I've yet to hear anyone actually say that about Obama. Like to say, you know, my main issue with him is just the fact that he's Black. That would be a very honest, I think, response for a lot of people, but no one says that. And so I think, you know, people then go into this whole rationalization process of, let me try to make my opposition look justified and make it look valid and make it look like it's, you know, something that has nothing to do with race. And, you know, in my book, there's whole theories around this. You know, that's what racism does in the modern era, is that you basically discriminate against black people and you make it seem like it's the black person's fault. That's an old hustle. That's his fault.
And you come up with ways to make them seem like they are the bad.
Yeah.
Bad. Oh my gosh! Wow, you're so smart. Is there a difference though, but you see with black men and black women?
Yeah, there is. And so we find, my colleague at Duke, Ashley Rosette, and I have a paper on what we call double jeopardy. And we put people in a role of leaders, and it was either a white man, a white woman, a black man, or a black woman. And we had the person make a mistake. The white men could make mistakes with impunity, right? Because it was never attributed to their competence. It was attributed to some external factor. Oh, the day was too hot. The air conditioning wasn't working. Whatever it happened to be, that's why he made a mistake. The woman, white woman, when she made a mistake, she got maybe one chance, two chances. The same with the black man. When the black woman made a mistake, she was the first to go, because she's not seen as being a prototypical leader because she doesn't possess maleness or whiteness, which are the two qualities in this society that sort of typify and in many ways define, traditionally or historically speaking, leadership. And black men have maleness, white women have whiteness, black women have neither. And so any mistake was seen as evidence that they were not cut out for the leadership position, and they were the first to go. So that's double jeopardy. And we find that black women in those kinds of situations are penalized even more than black men or white women.
Is this why black women don't vote for Donald Trump by a vast number? By the majority of the time, they're not voting for them.
I think it's because black women are so damn smart. It's hard to pull one over on black women. That's why they don't vote for Donald Trump.
Let's see. Speaking of, I would imagine it could be a black woman, maybe. Beth Bear says, what's the book's name again? People want to know what this book's name is.
Oh, okay. So the book's name is The Conversation. How seeking and speaking the truth about racism can radically transform individuals and organizations.
Do you have it right there? Is it at arm's length? The Conversation.
And yeah.
Go ahead.
No, and it's been great because the book has been, when you write a book like this, you never know how people are going to respond, and you don't know how white people are going to respond. You don't know how black people are going to respond. And one of the things I was most proudest of with this book is, the fact that it was nominated for an NAACP Image Award, and it also was a Financial Times Best Book. So we got white British people who love it, Black American people who love it, and white Americans. And so it was, and that was my goal, because again, when I write about this, I do so from a very calm, dispassionate, objective. Here's the facts, folks. Here's the truth, and that's why the subtitle is, seeking and speaking the truth. We've got to look for the truth, and we've got to speak about it. And you may not agree with some of the things that I put in the book, but it's not a book about my opinion. It's a book about the data, and I sort of address all of these questions that we're talking about today around, are people unqualified? In fact, I have a chapter that's called, Is it Race or Racism? And I ask the question, is it just that Black people and people of color are inferior? And I go deep into the molecular genetics and the molecular biology and DNA, and is there such thing as race, right? So there is no stone that I leave unturned in this book, and everything is fair game. I ask the question and then I answer it based on the science, based on the data, not based on my opinion.
Yeah, that's what I'm reading on my vacation next week, by the way, just so you know. But that was always planned. That was always in the plan. But I'm glad that I'm reading that book.
And we met, Don, by the way, in New Orleans at the New Orleans Book Fair a couple of years ago when I had your book had just come out and The Conversation had just come out, and we were both sort of at the book fair, and Mark Morial interviewed me for my book there, and I went to your I think it's called This Is the Fire.
This is the Fire. Yeah, what I say to my friends about racism, and it's some very similar things to what you said. We talked about bootstraps when, how do you pull yourself up if you don't have bootstraps? And some of the things that you said, I didn't go into specifically about are Black people really inferior, but similar topics, but not as much research as that. This was simply about about what I had been living over my, almost 30 years in journalism and my 40 some years as an adult. And, just some of the research that I had come out that I, had come up with just from being a journalist. And I was shocked. It debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And then, the publisher called and they said, "Hey, Don, your book is #1 on the New York Times bestseller list." And then I said, "Is that good?" And they said, "Are you out of your mind? Of course that's good." That was with Walter Isaacson. I think when I sat on stage with Walter Isaacson.
Yes.
Everybody get the conversation. Go to Amazon, go to your local, if you have a local bookstore, go and get the book from there. It's important that we keep our local bookstores, there and thriving and surviving. Also, thank you for supporting independent media. I see some of you today are. Make sure you hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. We're like just a few away from 180,000 subscribers, which is great within 2 months or so. So listen, I know, right? It's kind of crazy, right? Do you think in the future there will be a case that could find its way to the Supreme Court that it's going to restrict corporate diversity efforts, just like they did it with affirmative action, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to we've already done it, and Harvard was a big part of that. And ironically, they're called Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA, against Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill. And I do believe there's an all-out assault on this. I was going to do a diversity workshop. This was when Trump was in office, and they had to pull it at the last minute because he issued an executive order saying that you couldn't say the word white privilege, and you couldn't, and so this has been simmering for a while. And I think the ultra-right has got enough traction to push, and they're emboldened enough to push for something like that. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see it come across the desk of the U.S. Supreme Court.
I want to play this for you and get your take on it, because this is a video tweeted out just a few weeks ago by my friend who also has a streaming show, a digital show on YouTube, David Pakman. He calls out Republican attacks. He was doing a show, but someone on his show, or on his network, called out attacks on DEI, specifically from the angle that they themselves, meaning conservatives especially, that they benefit from political affirmative action. Here it is.
Republicans benefit greatly from the DEI programs that are enshrined in the United States Constitution. As many of you know, we don't pick our president based on the popular vote. I wish we did, but we don't. That would be the meritocratic way to do it. No, instead, we do so based on the Electoral College that gives extra weight to smaller states, and who just so happens to live in those smaller states disproportionately. It tends to be white, rural folks who are more likely to vote Republican. How about the United States Senate? That's even more of a DEI program, in my opinion. Every state, regardless of population, has 2 senators. So California's 39 million people are represented by 2 senators, exactly the same as Wyoming, even though they only have 600,000 people. They also get 2 senators. So I view this as a clear contradiction. If there's a better counter argument, I'd love to be made aware of it. There are, of course, countless examples of Republicans praising the Electoral College, but also being against diversity programs.
So, for Doctor, so I want to ask a question to any arch conservatives who may be watching. Why is DEI good when it comes to the Electoral College? Because that's what it is. It's diversity, right, in the electoral system, equity for people who may not have as big a voice, and inclusion for those same people. So why is it good politically, but it's not actually good for the business and for the bottom line of businesses? Why is it not good in that way?
Well, it goes back to the dolphins, the ostriches, and the sharks, right? For a shark, it's good if it gives me power. And for a shark, it's bad if it doesn't give me power. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's a classic case of hypocrisy. And I'm glad that he's able to call them out on it. We're humans. No one said you had to be consistent, but I think at least own, your inconsistency. So,
yeah. Listen, I know that you are not a political person, and I'm asking you, not exactly political, and I'm asking you a bunch of political questions, but we're in a political season, okay? Doctor is not a political animal, but I do want to know briefly, I want to pick your brain regarding one political topic, and that's Trump, Biden, and black voters. A little bit of context here. Obviously, black voters are going to play a key role in determining the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. And while black voters remain overwhelmingly Democratic and support Joe Biden over Donald Trump by a wide margin, Biden's advantage among these groups slipping. 2016, Trump received just 8% of the black vote. That's according to the exit polls, the highest level of support by black voters for any Republican since George Bush in 2000. While current opinion polls vary, a recent survey from Gen Forward shows that if the election were held today, 17% of black voters would vote for Donald Trump, while 20% said that they would vote for someone other than Trump or for Biden. So my question for you, Dr. Livingston, is what do you think is behind this erosion of black support for Biden, if you believe it?
So I do believe it, unfortunately. And I am political, and I teach at a public policy school, the Kennedy School. So, Ash Carter, the former Secretary of Defense, is right down the hallway. And, there's all kinds of political figures there. And so we have discussions about these kinds of things all the time. And it's a complicated answer, but a simple one would be, I think there's three things going on. One is how much people are looking at their lives locally versus universally, or in a micro way versus the macro way. And there are people who say, look, I was doing the same thing when Trump was president as Biden. I would go to the store, I would buy groceries, I'd take my kids to Little League. And a lot of people don't see differences in their actual lives from one president to another, whether it's Obama, Clinton, Bush, they just go on about the business of life. And I don't think they're really looking at the big picture about how it impacts these macro level policies. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I think a lot of people vote based on identity versus based on any kind of ideology. And what I mean by identity is basically who you identify with, right? So there were people who voted for George W. Bush because they felt they could have a cup of coffee with him, right? So this is affinity. And not really because of his policies. Many people didn't know the differences between Gore and Bush's policies. And I think for a lot of black people, Trump is so gangster, right? That he represents this sort of masculinity that I think many people identify with, that Biden, given his age and given his demeanor and given other things, doesn't represent. And so I think a lot of people, and especially you see a lot of rappers, right, that according to, what I'm seeing on the news, identifying with Donald Trump, right? And so I think that's just a personal level of identity, the extent to which you sort of seek to emulate, or the extent to which you identify with certain qualities that individual has. And I think for a lot of people, Trump is, it's gangster, right? And then the third thing I think is, some people are just registered Republicans. There's diversity within the black community too. And so there are going to be black Republicans and people who vote for the Republican nominee because they're Republicans. So I think it's those three things that kind of explain why people, are willing to vote for him, because they don't necessarily see their lives as being any different under Biden. And in many ways, due to inflation, they see it as being worse. And many people don't understand the complex factors that contribute to something like inflation. And a president can't really, it goes beyond any one person. There's a beautiful documentary about Jimmy Carter that talks about how he inherited the inflation from the Nixon era. He fixed it, and then Reagan got the credit for it after him, right? So, I think that's just the way it goes in politics.
Yeah. Wow. Do you think, well, one question real quick before, because I got a couple things. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. Do you think that we should get rid of the Electoral College?
I do.
You do?
We're the only industrialized nation that has it, and it's not representing the will of the people. And then you end up with a situation like the Supreme Court that doesn't represent the sentiments of most of the American people, and they're making laws that impact everyone. That's not a government of the people, by the people, for the people, because it's not representing the majority of the people. And the system was set up like that. And we have to keep in mind that the Electoral College historically is a relic of the Civil War. It was part of the compromise with Southern states, right? They gave them, as that gentleman before mentioned, affirmative action, right? It sort of said, okay, we're going to give you more say than you deserve in how business is run, because we want to sort of make nice and we want to reconcile and bring us all back together. So we're going to, sort of bend a little bit. And I think they bent too much.
So even though, I mean, some like the gentleman said in the clip there, that it's diversity, equity, inclusion for Republicans, they're going to say, well, you want to get rid of that. Well, why don't you just get a DEI altogether if you think it's DEI for Republicans? You don't think it's apples to apples?
Well, in many ways, I don't think, I think the Electoral College is not really DEI because there's not equity. If you've got 39 million people and they get 2 senators, and you've got 600,000 people and they get 2 senators, that is not equity. It's reverse discrimination, right? It's basically saying white people have more senators representing them than the people of color who live on the coast.
No, that's just plain old discrimination. Reverse discrimination would be equality. Yeah. Well, okay, I get you. All right, so do you actually believe that Trump could get up to 20% of the black vote?
No, I don't think it would.
You don't? Okay.
No, not that.
Okay. All right. So listen, what I told you about when about African Americans having advantage in certain aspects of the world, whether it be college admissions or whether it be jobs. This is Sam Harris. This is part of the conversation that I had that I want to get your response to. Here it is.
Sure.
All the causes of racism that you've alleged are clearly in the past. I mean, we're not going to debate what 1950s America was like, and the consequences of redlining, etc. All right, so we see the legacy of our past racism, but the question is, what is enforcing inequality today? And what we have actually is to come back to the overcorrection. To the contrary, we have in the most desirable parts of culture a flipping of the dial where you're positively advantaged if you're a person of color, and I would say especially if you're black, assuming you have anything like the same qualifications for the job. And if you can ask yourself whether you want to be black, applying to the best medical schools in the country, or to try to get a job at Netflix, or to get a job with the Ford Foundation.
I don't believe that, Sam, because the numbers just don't bear that out. If you look at
the numbers of admissions, the criteria
for
admissions,
okay. But if you look at what the numbers of admissions, look at the Fortune 500 companies, or the CEOs of the world, or as a matter of fact, the doctors of the world, or as a matter of fact, the pilots of the world. How many of them are people of color? I think that when being admitted to college is something different than actually becoming a head of an organization or a part of an organization once there is no admission process.
So, in my book, I also talk about this concept called compartmentalization. And it goes something like this. If you're in a custody hearing or you're going to get a divorce and you're in a custody hearing about who gets the kids, it might be to your advantage to be a woman because there are stereotypes that say, the kid should be with the woman. If you want to be in the fashion industry, it might be to your advantage to be gay because the stereotypes say that you're more creative. If you're an NBA player, it might be to your advantage to be black because there's stereotypes that say you're a better athlete and you might actually get a better chance of being picked if you're black than if you're white. Or you might have a better chance of getting hired by Versace if you're gay versus straight. Or you might have a better chance of getting your kids if you're a mom versus a dad. But to then say, women have all the benefits in society, it's better to be a woman, or it's better to be gay, or it's better to be black, is ridiculous. Because privilege doesn't mean that you have privilege in 1 million out of 1 million situations. Privilege means that you may have privilege in 999,555 situations out of 1 million. And that there are going to be maybe a few hundred situations out of 1 million that somebody else, right? The world is just a complex place. So even if it's better to be black when you apply to medical school, that's only one small aspect of life for a small percentage of people. But to then say that society has overcorrected and black people enjoy more privileges is ridiculous. But that's always been a game that conservatives have played. is you find one example, right? And guys did this in the 1950s. They say, my wife has more power because she runs the kitchen. I can't even go in the kitchen, right, when she's in there. So how can you say, that there's patriarchy? Well, yeah, maybe your wife does have more say over what's cooked for dinner, but that's not really power. And if it is, it's one very small. So I think you have to be careful to not fall victim to that hustle where they take one really specific thing and then they make that mountain out of that molehill, right? So I won't even, if I was with him, I wouldn't even get into a whole conversation about, well, is that true? Medical school is not. I would say in the grand scheme of the world, medical school admission accounts for 0.00001% of someone's existence, right? And there's all these other things like, would you rather be shot walking down, or would you rather be black walking down the street, right? When there's police coming on, right? Ask him that. Like, are you advantaged being black when it comes to interactions with the police? Ask, is it better to be black if you want to storm the Capitol, right? Ask, is it better to be black if you want to have any sort of freedom? Because that's what we're talking about today, Don, is freedom, right? And we're not talking about exceptions. We're talking about the rule. And I want to keep people focused on what happens most of the time. And by most, I don't even mean 51%. I mean 99% of the time. Don't talk to me about the 1%.
Preach, brother. That's what I said earlier about being able to articulate. You're much better suited to articulate it than most folks. One more I want to play, and then I'll get your response. Here it is.
But I do think that the left, the far left, is in large part culpable for energizing the far right. I'm not saying that there weren't racists before we had people like Ibram X. Kendi going around telling us that everyone was racist, but he's made matters far worse. And the promotion of that kind of narrative by the at the highest points of culture, right? In media, in Hollywood, in nonprofit institutions. I mean, there's been a complete capture of elite culture by a very woke understanding of just how excruciating racism still is in America. And that, I think, has largely amounted to a gaslighting of much of our society. And it has, if we get Trump again for 4 more years, I'm largely going to blame the far left of the Democratic Party for that. I just think it's, everything from drag queen story hour to, just the endless, arithmetic around pronouns to, the Jussie Smollett and, the summer of 2020 and, just mostly peaceful protests on your own former network. All that stuff so gaslit people and enraged people right of center that we still have, in large part, I think that's why.
Well, it sounds like you're saying it's caused people to be racist. I don't know if I buy that, Sam.
Well, no,
I understand what you're saying.
It hasn't caused people to be racist. It's caused people to become very cynical and to lose their patience for obviously spurious claims of racism. And
wow. Okay. Well, I think he summed it up when he said lose their patience, because that's something white people are very good at doing when it comes to people of color. And I mentioned this before with that one study. If you're a black woman, you make one mistake, you're out and it's your fault, because you're not a perfect human. And yet a white man can make 20 mistakes, right? So I think arguments like that, to me, really, I think they really represent this abuse. And it's kind of the hallmark of an abusive relationship, is that it's your fault that you're being mistreated. And if you didn't do X, if you didn't burn the toast, then I wouldn't have done this. Or if you didn't do this, right? So he's saying if Ibram X. Kendi didn't call people racist, then they wouldn't be racist. And it's sort of his fault for inflaming people. Or, you got Jussie Smollett, that he's blaming one person who might have had a mental health crisis or whatever for causing racism because, he misrepresented something that happened, which, by the way, does happen to a lot of black people. So it wasn't a complete misrepresentation. It was just a misrepresentation in this one case. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Again, maybe I'm getting cynical, and he used that word, but I don't buy into all of the passive aggression. I call it out every time to say, this is something. In White Fragility, that's a book by Robin DiAngelo. There's a whole book about this, that, white people get upset when you call them racist. And in today's world, it's much worse to be called racist than it is to be racist. And that's the problem.
That part. That part. Doctor, you're amazing. The perfect person to have on Juneteenth and the perfect person to have moving forward. I hope you would come on. We can talk about a whole host of things. I love your mind. I love that, just how open you are. I love that you call it out. I love that you can inform the electorate. Can you just go on and be seen in as many places as possible in the coming months so that people can be educated about, what they're doing and, what they're going to do in the ballot box in November? Can you just please make that promise to me? Help us.
I'll try, Don.
Dr. Robert Livingston is a brilliant man, as you can see. He's a social psychologist, a leading expert on the science underlying bias and racism in organizations, and a lecturer of public policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Dr. Livingston, thank you. I would take some questions, but I know you want to go enjoy your Juneteenth. I would take questions from our audience, but I'll talk to them and let you go.
All right.
It easy. Take it
Don,
easy.
Thanks. It was good seeing you.
Bless you. Thank you. Good seeing you as well.
Bye-bye.
So that's Dr. Robert Livingston. Man, guys, didn't you enjoy that? You can click off, Doctor, whenever you're ready. Didn't you guys enjoy that? That was amazing. This is what we do on this show. We inform people. And I made a promise to inform the electorate before the November election, and that's what we're doing. We are having guests on that let you know what's real and what's not, that separates the bullshit from the truth. And you don't really get that a lot in corporate media. You get the food fight, and then, everybody's yelling at each other, and then you go to the commercial break. You don't have to do that here, and you get a chance to weigh in. So, Seal Bear 23 says, thank you, Don. By the way, the book is called The Conversation by Dr. Robert Livingston. Make sure you read it. That's what I'm going to read next week when I'm on vacation for part of the time. Thank you, Don and Dr. Livingston. Seal Bear 23. Nalthea says, food for thought. Yes. Irvana Mitchell says, absolutely. Darius Shannon, happy holidays. Zen Soul says, thank you, Doctor. You are awesome. You're an awesome guest. Yes. The Conversation is his book, says Nicole. Make sure you hit the thumbs up. I'm not sure how many we have, but we are just a few, maybe not even a few hundred, maybe a few tens away from 180,000 subscribers. Great conversation, says Bob Ogilvy. Yes. Great show, Don, says Abby. Oh, Abby, I lost her comment. It went up. Tracy said that was great. Wasn't it great? You could just sit back and listen to him. And again, everything that he says is based in research and fact. It's not opinion. It's not him bloviating and yelling at a guest or yelling at someone, a host, and saying, oh my gosh, you're crazy. And I love having that kind of conversation. Are you having a good Juneteenth? Did you have a good Juneteenth? Did you enjoy yourself? Did you reflect on what the day means? Did you get some people asking you, I don't know why we have the day off? I never really hear people ask that question, not really, when it's some holiday that they don't find, that they don't have some sort of familiarity with or some sort of kinship with. Look, we have a day off that for Santa Claus, right? I know it's supposed to be about the birth of Jesus, but still, every holiday is made up in a sense, because do you actually need a day off from work to celebrate Christmas? Do you actually need a day off from work to celebrate Hanukkah? Do you actually need a day off from work to celebrate Thanksgiving? You don't really need a day off, because the commemoration and the celebration is in here. I mean, let's be honest. Every single holiday is made up. Mother's Day, someone said, hey, let's have Mother's Day. Came up with it. You don't have the day off. And someone said, Christian said, hey, it's Easter. We'll make it this Sunday. I'm just saying, let's just be real. So Juneteenth is now a national holiday, so I think that folks should be good with it. Celebrated Juneteenth this weekend, but enjoyed the extra time with my kids today. That's great. New law requires all Louisiana public school. Oh, we saw that, classrooms to display the 10 Commandments. Now that is a damn shame. And let me tell you, I went to school in Louisiana. I went to Catholic school in Louisiana, where the 10 Commandments were displayed. But guess what? It was a Catholic school where we prayed every day. Before we went to class, let me tell you. And look, in my new book that comes out in September, I talk about this. We lined up, it was like military school almost. We lined up in the yard, and we'd have to put out our hand like this, and it would have to touch the shoulder of the person in front of us, and we lined up according to height. And so we put our arms, and we'd have to be straight, and everybody wore uniforms, and they would do the announcements in the morning, and then we would do the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we'd do the national anthem, and then we would pray. And then we would go to class in lines, right? It wasn't just like you strolled into class and you sat down with your book bag. No, you did not do that. You were in a line, and it started with the kids who were in nursery school. They went to their classes first. Then the kindergartners went, then the first grade went, then the second grade went, and the third grade went, and everybody went in a line. Discipline, right? Catholic school. So it was a private school. They have different rules. Public schools, my friends who went to public school did not have such rules. They did not line up. They did not have to pray. I think they did back then. They didn't have to pray. They didn't have to say the national anthem. They didn't have to do any of that stuff. So I don't believe that you should be putting the 10 Commandments in schools, just as I don't believe that you should be putting passages from the Quran in school, right? Or the Bhagavad Gita in school, or whatever it is, whatever text that you study. I just don't think that you should be doing that, because we're supposed to be a nation of religious freedom, right? The separation of church and state. So I think now the ACLU is fighting that, and what did I say? The Bhagavad Gita, yes. So I don't think that that obviously they should be doing that, but let's see what happens. That I think this is going too far, and if you have any idea of what's going to happen in 2020, past November of 2024 into 2025 onto 2028, this is an example. If the wrong person gets into office. So that's it. I'm through. I can't believe that's happening. I cannot believe that's happening, and that's from my home state. Too bad the government in Louisiana does not practice the 10 Commandments. Thank you, Bob Ogilvy, because if they practice the 10 Commandments, they would not be pushing it on everybody else. Okay? So, thank you. Make sure you hit the thumbs up before you leave, and we will see you. What's today? Today is Wednesday, right? We'll see you tomorrow on Thursday. It's Juneteenth. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.